Okay, and we're live. Hi, students. Welcome back. We're going on to the next lecture for our business ethics series. We've covered the normative theory of ethics. We started off with knowing about the relationships between morality, the law, and business ethics as a whole. We moved on to the normative theory of ethics, where we covered the various theories that govern business ethics and the decision-making process. We moved on to look at how ethical applications can start in a organizational perspective in corporate responsibility. And today we're going to look into how we can apply business ethics while working in a capitalist society. So this is business ethics in the context of capitalism, right? So let me run through my notes here and we'll get started. So the learning objectives are as follows. To define capitalism and identify the 4 key features of a capitalist economic system. Understand the moral justifications for capitalism as an acceptable system. Understand some of the different perspectives on economic distribution as part of considering the moral implications of an economic system. So we'll start off looking at capitalism as a whole. What is a capitalist system? What is a capitalist society? What are the key features that comprise of a capitalism economy, as well as the moral justifications behind, as well as the criticisms of the capitalist system. Okay. We'll also look into some of the theoretical operations and criticisms of capitalism, as I mentioned earlier, and the features of socialism. The features and key and criticisms of socialism as an economic system. Okay, so as a start, we're going to define what is capitalism. It's simply this: it's an economic distribution in which the majority of resource and materials distribution is in the hands of private owners. Okay, resource and distribution, production and distribution is in private hands, operating under what is termed a profit system, or also known as a market system. Okay? So always remember, in order for any economy to call themselves a capitalist economy, the means of production and distribution, in other words, the raw materials, as well as the distribution, the selling of those materials, whatever products that those materials come made of, so the input and the output must be in the hands of a private owner or private organizations. So a little bit of historical background before we had the capitalism system. We started off with guilds, in which you have groups of individuals, say for example a group of carpenter, a group of plumbers, a group of cobblers. They all form together association where they set together what services do they render, what are the pricing that they will set, so on and so forth, and what are the parameters that go behind whatever they offer as a service. So those are guilds. Okay, so think of them as small little associations that protect a certain expertise or a certain line of business. And then we have mercantilism or mercantile capitalism, in which this is based on mutual dependence between state and commercial interests. So here you're looking at capitalism at a much larger scale, where you have, say for example, countries relying on other countries for certain raw materials. So here you start thinking of import, export, buying things where you cross country borders. Just think about it this way. If you're going to grow your industry, any industry in your country, you cannot rely on whatever that you have. Some of the raw materials in your country may not be sufficient for you to self-sustain or be industrious, right? So you do have to import some of those things. So whether that be raw materials, whether that be talent, or you're importing workers, these are part of mercantilism, right? Import-export. We're looking at the key features of capitalism here. Now there are 4 features, right? 4 key requirements that you must have in order to make up a capitalist system. The first 2 are companies and profit motive. So let's start off with companies. Companies, they all have a legal stature. I've talked about this in chapter 3. okay, in the last chapter, where companies and organizations, they share many similarities with human beings, in which they can buy and sell. Human beings buy and sell. They can sue and they can sue each other. Organizations can sue another organizations, but there is one thing that an organization can do in which humans cannot, and what that is that organizations have the ability to outlive any human being. Okay, so I'm sure you've known organizations that has been around hundreds of years, and way beyond the lifespan of its founders and its owners. So think about Steve Jobs, for example. He started Apple. Now he's no longer around, but the business of Apple as an organization is still running very, very strong, much stronger than when he was around. Number two, any businesses must be driven by the motivation to earn profit. So you need to be profit driven. So it is based on the critical assumptions that human beings are essentially economic creatures, and we are all self-interested. And what that means is we make decisions in efforts to further our own economic interests, our own well-being. So whether that be buying things to sustain your own health, right? Buying a health insurance to sustain your own health, in order to protect your own well-being. Buying a car, for example, going for your studies, going for having an education. These are all decisions that we make to protect our own self-interest, to make sure that we have as a human being, as an individual, we have a future, right? To safeguard the future, to safeguard our lives, to safeguard the people around us. Okay, so we are essentially economic driven creatures, but are also very self-interested. So we protect ourselves. We make a lot of decisions to protect ourselves. Otherwise, think of it this way. If we are not self-interested, we would not go to the doctor when we are sick. As simple as that. All right. The other two features are competition and private property. Competition is a very key and important feature within a capitalist system. For one is that it prevents prices from escalating. We'll get to that later when we talked about the invisible hand, which I have touched on a little bit in topic 3, right? So it prevents prices from escalating because people have the ability to choose from different suppliers or different sellers. Next is private property, and that's the fourth feature. So remember we talked when I talked about the definition of capitalism, in which you have the means of production and distribution in private hands. So you have to own certain properties in order for your business or your organizations to be considered as part of the capitalist system. So it requires private ownership of major means of production and distribution. Here you're talking about things like raw materials, a factory, for example, a building, the equipments that you own, the copyrights that you have, the patents that you have to your business, or if you are in F&B, right? KFC, for example, has not revealed their famous fried chicken recipes for forever, isn't it? So that's how they safeguard their own interests and their own business by making sure all this is still in private hands. It's not public information, right? So again, you have companies, profit motive, competition, and private property. And all in all, this all pretty much comes together to give us an experience, sort of, right? So for example, I chose Coca-Cola here to represent sort of what a capitalism company can look like, right? So you have this brand, Coca-Cola, in which the competition is in the form of Pepsi. They have means of production and distribution, right? Of course, they have they safeguard their own recipe in the form of the beverage, the cola beverage, right? Coca-Cola does not own the cola industry. They do monopolize it, but making cola drinks, right, is not Coca-Cola's sole right, right? Cola tasting drinks has been around for a long time. However, Coca-Cola's recipe is Coca-Cola's alone, right? nobody knows how they make their drink taste the way they do, right? So it is a proprietary recipe. They have their own buildings, so they are a profit-driven, commercially interested organization, right? So all in all, they come together to give you that feeling, right? Selling you the enjoyment, right? Being part of a group of people, being part of having the sense of belonging that you have tasted a drink like Coca-Cola, right? Whether when you buy an Apple product, for example, it gives you the feeling that you're part of the Apple community, right? So at the end of the day, we don't really buy products for its, we rarely buy brands, especially. We rarely buy products for its usage or its utility, but rather we buy it to sort of fulfill our own desires of wanting to be part of a certain echelon of standards, whether that be a very high-end standards, right? Nobody buys Yeezy shoes, for example, because it's useful, right? You buy it in order for you to feel like you can have the right to say, you have the bragging right to say that I have Yeezy shoes. It's as simple as that, right? We don't exactly need a $1,000 phone, but we do that because it's part of that human emotions, human longing, that you want to be part of this group that that has all these products, that has that can say that you have that experience. Okay, so all in all, it is basically to sell us the experience of being part of something, the experience of being able to partake or join a group of people that has enjoyed such a product before. Okay? Now, organizations can go on and grow themselves. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of the term of not putting all your eggs in a single basket, right? So companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, for example, they are all so big that they don't rely on just selling one product. Although they may be known for selling a single product, right? But their investments, their business go well beyond just that one category of product alone, as illustrated by this graph over here. So you see names like Coca-Cola, Kraft. Kraft, for example, we know them from what? Selling cheeses. Or Nestle, selling beverages and cookies. But little do you know that Nestle also owns companies like L'Oreal, who is in the business of health, pharmaceutical, beauty, right? So it's interesting how an organization can sell you products that can arguably make you unhealthy, fat, diabetic, but also at the same time go into the business of beauty and making you look good. But again, you see how businesses do their best to diversify where all their money comes in and where all the profits come in, right? So this is an example of oligopolies, right? Monopoly is when a business literally have control over the majority of the profit sharing of that one particular product category. So say, for example, Apple has monopoly over music players, iPods, right? Through iPods. Or Colgate has monopoly over the toothpaste industry, right? But oligopolies is when you have one company having control over multiple product categories. So you have Disney, for example, where instead of having monopoly over the film industry, they also have monopoly over the or getting to the point where they have monopoly over the streaming industry, where previously held by Netflix. So I hope you understand the difference between monopoly and oligopolies. Think of oligopolies as a larger scale of monopoly. Okay. Now there are a few justifications of why capitalism is good, why capitalism is a positive thing for society. The moral justifications of capitalism. Two of them being the natural right to property and the concept of the invisible hand. Okay, so let's just start off with the natural right to property before I get to this. Okay, so the natural right of property, essentially what it is it is an assumption within the study of capitalism that all humans have the right to own something. whether you start off with owning clothes on your body or whatever that you buy. Property here does not always mean large scale items like a car or an apartment or a house. It can mean anything that you have, essentially. So again, like I said, we are economically driven creatures, and having things is just that natural right that we assume that we all have. Owning things is that natural right that we assume all of us have. Okay. The second one is the assumption of the invisible hand. Now, I've talked about what the invisible hand is earlier, the concept of the invisible hand by Adam Smith, okay, where you have that invisible force of supply and demand that eventually balances the economy to reach some kind of an equilibrium. And I gave the example of the bread seller, right? I'm sure it's here somewhere. Let me go back to this one. So I think I skipped a slide. It's all right. So just to give you a short recap on what invisible hand is, just imagine where if you have only one person within your society that sells bread, right? There is no other choice for you except to go to this person to buy your daily bread, right? You eat it, you need it. It's a staple. Okay, so this person will make a buckload of money selling bread because he is the only person selling it within your society, within your area, for example. So eventually, someone's going to figure out that, hey, this bread making business is very good. They want a slice of the pie, for example. So eventually, the second bread seller will turn up somewhere, right? Giving competition to the original bread seller. And this process will go on and on and on and on until the prices go up and down and eventually comes to a point where it stabilizes. Okay? So it is the basic premise on what controls the price of oil and gas in the world today. Okay? Recently, during the COVID-19 crisis, you've seen the price of oil and gas plummet, going really, really low because demand is just not there. Nobody's going out, nobody's driving their cars, the factories are not running, so there's no need for petroleum or any sort of oil and gas to run all these large-scale machineries. So naturally, no planes are flying as well. So naturally, the demand for oil and gas goes down. But you see, when we recover, when the world sort of restarts its engine, when the industry starts doing business again, then the demand will slowly go up, and eventually the oil prices will go up again, right? Nothing in terms of government intervention or anyone can sort of manipulate the prices from going up and down. It is only driven by one thing and one thing only: the forces of supply and demand. And these forces are, by its very nature, invisible to the naked eye. Right? You don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know how it's going to happen. But you know that it will happen at some point in life. All right? So that's the concept of the invisible hand. The whole point is it is an invisible force. And that force will eventually bring the market to an equilibrium point, also known as the balance point. Okay? The problem with the invisible hand is that it can take some time for the market to stabilize. Okay? The thing is, we don't know when that second bread seller will come along. You just don't know unless you're the one that's going to do it. So you don't know when the next touch wood, right? When the next wave of viruses or any problems in society comes along that will sort of push the oil and gas prices down. We just don't know. So the point is, you can't really rely on it. You don't really know what's going to happen. Okay, so the when it reaches an equilibrium point, that's good for any customers. It's good for any sort of it's good for consumers, essentially. I lost my train of thought a while ago. So it's good for consumers when the invisible hand forces the supply and demand of anything to reach a balance point. But it can take a long time to get there. That's the problem with the invisible hand. And if it does not ever get there, you run the risk of prices going really high for a really long time. And again, we've seen it with the demand of oil and gas, where it went up to way up to a point of $100 per barrel. Now it's sitting at about $21, $22 a barrel. So you see how huge that gap can get when things like oil and gas becomes an uncontrollable asset for society. Okay, so those are the arguments that is in support of capitalism. So now we'll go on and talk about the two arguments that are against capitalism. The first one is that there are moral limits on how much wealth can a person gather. How rich can you really get? Okay, because we all know, we've all asked this question before. If only I can get $1 million in my bank account, I won't work another day in my life. We've all had that. We've all had that sort of I don't know, a dream. We've all daydream of one day becoming a millionaire, right? And just live off the interest. But how often have you seen one person stop at $1 million? Get what I'm saying? So at some point, right, morality would suggest that you would realize that you've had enough and stop working to earn more money. But we rarely see that in human beings. So there comes a point, or sort of like a conflict within us, that will always ask the question, how rich can someone really get? Or how rich should someone actually get? Okay, how rich, how much wealth should a person be able to amass? Should there be a cap? Should there be a legal limit on how rich someone should be? Okay, you think of all the richest people in the world right now: Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, for example. I mean, that guy, he's worth about what, $120 billion at this point. There is, and if I'm not mistaken, there is a statistic there's an organization that did a study on him. And again, if memory serves me right, I could be wrong here, but there is a study that shows that Jeff Bezos basically makes anywhere between $600,000 to $700,000 per day. Okay, $600,000 to $700,000 per day. Nobody on earth needs that much money to run every day. Okay, that's for an individual. That's not even about, I'm not talking about Amazon making so much money per day. And if it is so, that's fine. That's how organizations can make so much money. But as an individual, Jeff Bezos makes about $600,000 per day. Now, at some point, you're going to ask, how much is too much? Okay, now I can't give you an answer to this. That's why it's called business ethics. The whole point of it is subjective. At the end of the day, it's not how much you earn, it's not how much you have, but it's what you do with it, right? And the second argument is the issue of wealth, creating wealth without the need for labor. Okay, let me give you some idea here. Let's say if all of a sudden you you get a windfall of $10 million in your bank account, right? And you don't have to work a single day of your life anymore. And you decide to live off the interest that is coming off the $10 million. And you're perfectly entitled to do that, no problem. But therein lies the conflict of wealth creating wealth, because without even lifting a finger, automatically now the money just keeps coming in, right? The interest that comes from that $10 million can support you if you live moderately enough, right? If you live within a certain means of the interest that the money can produce. So the same applies for a lot of wealthy people nowadays. They get a point where they're so rich that their income generates further income for them without them even needing to lift a finger. Take Bill Gates, for example. All credit goes to him for making Microsoft what it is today, in today's standards, but millions still goes to his bank account every day. Now, granted, he's channeled a lot of that money through his charity foundation, and that's a good thing. But even if he doesn't, right? Let's say he just sits back on his couch and does nothing but watch Netflix every day. Millions of dollars would still go into his bank account, even if he does not work in Microsoft anymore. Now, one can argue that it can lean on the side of being a little bit unfair when there are people who needs to slog every day and will never ever make marginally as much as he does, right? So there is that sense of unfairness in society, which is created by this very system of capitalism. Okay, so continuing on this notion of moral justifications, the theory rests on the view that human beings are rational creatures, again, motivated by self-interest. Motivated by self-interest. But we all aspire to something, to a society that is more or bigger than our own self, right? Everyone coming together, helping each other out. But capitalism is not like that. The very foundation of capitalism rests on the notion that we need to go for our dreams, build our own life, right? The very essence of the American dream is founded uh, based on that mantra or motto, right? So naturally competitive and primarily motivated by self-interest. So as much as you believe society is very works together as one, very united, the this economic system does not point to that direction. So it presents little of an ideal, a little way. It's not really an ideal way for society to aspire to be very competitive, to be driven by self-interest most of the time. Contemporary capitalism, in other words, the capitalism that we have today, requires you to keep on buying and consuming. Otherwise, capitalism does not work, right? So, although we have that four key features, but in order for the system to work, you need money to keep on going round and round. Keeping your money does not help capitalism one bit. It is spending and buying and spending and buying. Okay? Keep on consuming. In fact, there is a saying that capitalism is essentially having a continuous effort for businesses to make to make us think that what we use into something that what we use up. Okay, let me just rephrase that again. Capitalism is an aim for businesses to make consumers believe that things that we use are often things that we can use up. Okay? Things that we use up are things like, I mean, just to put it into perspective, are things such as our food, for example, rice, noodles, shampoo. These are things that we will use up eventually, right? We'll finish using it. So we won't mind replenishing all these things on a regular basis. But large scale items like your refrigerator, your TV, your car, for example, you don't look into changing those things very often, at least not for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. But you see that trend slowly starting to change. Okay? TVs don't last for 5 years anymore. Refrigerators don't last for 20 years anymore like they used to. Your phones, things that people use for 3, 4, 5 years at a go back then, 10 years ago, now something that people view to replace every 1 or 2 years. Okay, again, it is looking at things that we use as things that we use up. That's essentially how businesses want us to sort of view the things that we have every day. Okay, so the system, I'm going to point number 1 here. The system requires people in general to choose working more. Choose working more so that they can consume more, which is perfectly rational, because if you want to increase your buying power, you have to earn more. In order to earn more, you have to work harder. Quite simple. Okay. Now, research has found that through the years, even though people are earning a lot more money nowadays, incomes have grown exponentially. People are no less happier than they were today compared to, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago. Okay. There is uh, a study that tried to measure the scale of happiness in terms of its citizens in a country. And I'm not too sure if you've read that study, but what it says essentially is that the hardest working countries in the world, like Japan, Singapore, for example, are one of the unhappiest countries in terms of life satisfaction and life goals, essentially. But countries such as the Nordic countries like Sweden, Finland, for example, they all rank highest among the happiest countries in the world. And they also happen to be the country that you may not know this, but those countries also happen to be countries that charges the highest in terms of tax. So something to think about there. So again, you must realize that what you want and what you need, although it is easier said than done, what you want and what you need is completely different, right? We want a lot of things. And the key to a good capitalist system is to always make us wanting more, right? And so much so to the point where making us wanting more would make us eventually think that we need more, right? So overall, it's not a perfect system. Okay, so we're at a point now. Just to give you a recap, we've talked about the what capitalism is, how it came to be, a brief historical background on capitalism, its key features, companies, profit-driven, private hands, um, things like that, as well as we've talked about the moral justifications for capitalism and against capitalism. So you know by now that it is n- n- not by a long stretch, right? It's not even a perfect system, but it is the system that we have. And we do have to figure out how we're going to live with the system, as unperfect as it is. All right? So, that being said, what sort of economic arrangement that would best promote human happiness? There's a few things you have to consider in terms of having a proper economic arrangement to promote human happiness. First, the economic ownership. Number two, organizing the production and distribution. Number three, the type of authority arrangement within the units of production. And what that means is who governs those natural resources. Okay, so the first one, we know that the economic ownership, we are in a capitalist system. It is private ownership, not government ownership. Number two, the way of organizing production and distribution, that's in the company's hands. Those are in private hands. Number three, authority arrangement within the units of production. So you need some kind of a government intervention there to make sure that distribution is somewhat managed and taken care of. The range and character of material incentives, and the nature and extent of social security and welfare provisions. So what that essentially means is that if you want an economic system that governs and protects human happiness and puts that as a main priority, you have to handle those things well, and you have to figure out a system that a fail-safe system that would make sure that things like economic ownership, production and distribution, authority arrangement, material incentives, and social security and welfare provisions are there for people to feel like they are taken care of. Okay, and we'll look into the two methods that would allow that to happen. Right? Again, we are now looking into how what can we do in a capitalist system that would best ensure that people can still remain happy. Okay, so this is what we call the libertarian approach. Okay, again, going back to the whole idea that we are all driven by self-interest, we are all self-interested creatures. We like the idea that we are free, right? Humans, we love the idea that freedom is on our hands, and it is up to us to go get what we want, study what we want, get the jobs that I want, and work and earn the money that I want to earn, to buy whatever I want to buy and live the way I want to live, right? For a lot of people, that is essentially what happiness is. As long as I can do what I want and I'm not breaking the law, that's happiness, right? I can be with my family, I can live the life that I want, I can do the job that I really love. That's happiness. But how do you get there? How do you get there correctly? That is what we call the libertarian approach. Liberty means freedom, right? What is the freedom? What is the approach that would give us the freedom to do whatever we want to do? Okay, economic wise. So, first, there are a few principles here. The first one is the whole concept of justice. Individual must have the rights to be free from interference. Okay? Justice is an ideal of liberty. So we must have the right to be free from interference. That's requirement number one. For people to be happy, I need to have that freedom from interference. Okay? I need to be free from people telling me what to do. I need to be free from people blocking my way, right? Blocking my path when it comes to where I want to go, what I want to do with my life. Free from interference. So I should do whatever I want, assuming I don't break any laws doing it. Okay? Next, the right to own property. That's a fundamental right. Everyone has the right to the products of his or her labor. So that's the right to own property. So I should have the right from interference. Okay? Don't disturb me. Let me do what I want to do. Number two, I should also have the rights to own property. Number three, the third assumption is that fraud is wrong. So I cannot break the law. Right? I cannot break the law. I should be free to do what I want. I should be free to own whatever I want, but I cannot break the law doing it. Okay? That's the fundamental, that's the key fundamentals to first set right before you go on and earn a living, or before you go on and build your wealth, essentially. So that's the libertarian approach. There are two perspectives when it comes to the libertarian approach. The first one is Nozick's entitlement theory. So again, we talked about how you can set the stage for you to earn a living, live the life that you want, and do whatever you want to do. Right? Again, we are assuming that this is the path to happiness. Promote human happiness. Right? So you cannot. You should be free from interference. You're free to own things, and you cannot break the law. All right. So that's the fundamental assumptions that you must have, and then you go do whatever you want to do. Now, now that we set this right, how do you build your wealth? How do you do it correctly? What is considered legal? What is considered the correct way to say that this is yours? That's where the Nozick's entitlement theory come in, right? Robert Nozick came up with the entitlement theory. And what that essentially is that it outlines three basic steps or three criterias that you must fulfill in order for you to say that this item belongs to you, this money belongs to you, this product belongs to you, this property belongs to you. Okay? Anything that you say belongs to you needs to fulfill these three criteria. So let's look at them one by one. First one is that a person who acquires a holding, now this is in his own words, yeah? A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition. You have your pen right now, or if you have a highlighter, highlight this sentence, justice in acquisition. So a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. Number two, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer. So we have justice in acquisition. Now you highlight justice in transfer. Is entitled to that holding. Number three, No one is entitled to a holding except by the applications of step 1 and step 2, which is justice in acquisition and justice in transfer. So let me break that down into a more simplistic explanation. What that basically means is that if you want to say that this something belongs to you, okay, or something you have is your property, you have to go through one of two steps. Number one is that justice in acquisition. What does that mean? It means that if you want to say that this is something that you acquire on your own, acquisitions means you acquire something, you either have to, number one, make it yourself, or you found it from somewhere that has no ownership prior to this. Okay, you either make it yourself or you found it from a place from a place that has no ownership. For example, you need to harken back to the topic 1 or topic 2, where I gave you the example of what happens if you find money, right? What happens if you find money? The most of your answers came about saying it's all right to pick it up, but it's not, isn't it? If you, say for example, if you come to my house and you found $50 lying on the floor, does it give you the right to say that the money is yours? No, because the property belongs to me. The money was found in a place that belongs to someone. So at best, you can give it back to the owner of the property. Does that make sense? The same thing when you find a passport or you find a wallet in a mall, you can't say that is yours because the mall has ownership. The shopping center has an ownership. It has an ownership system. So you have to go through that system in order to find who owns that wallet, who that wallet belongs to. All right? However, if you find a natural resource, let's say, or if you find something in a place that nobody owns, okay, now let's say you find that same amount of money, $50, or you found that wallet in an open sea, international waters. Nobody owns the sea, right? So if you find a wallet in open international waters, you can call it your own. No problem, because you found it. And you found it in a place that nobody owns. So that's principle of justice in acquisition. Okay? So either you found it from a place that nobody owns or you make it yourself. So if you buy the ingredients yourself, right? You have flour, you have water, you have yeast, you have eggs, for example, and you make a loaf of bread out of it, that bread belongs to you because you made it yourself. Does that make sense? As long as you buy the raw ingredients yourself. You steal it from somewhere, it's still wrong. So I hope you understand what justice in acquisition means by now. It is basically someone who acquires a holding, right? And if you find it from a source that nobody owns, that's justice in acquisition. The next one is justice in transfer. So you probably realize that justice in acquisition is not a very common thing. I mean, how often is it that you make something and you call it your own? I understand that we do cook and we do create dishes, but those are nothing major, right? The big ticket items like our salary, we have to work for it. And our car, our house, we have to work for it. We have to work really hard for it. We don't unless you are incredibly lucky, you're never gonna find a big pot of gold lying deep down in the ocean somewhere. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. So that leaves us with option number 2, justice in transfer. This is a more common way of acquiring your wealth. So again, you either make it yourself, build it yourself, find it yourself, or you can buy it with the principle of transfer. So if we go to a restaurant, okay, we pay money to eat our food. That's transferring. Okay, you're transferring money in exchange for food. That's principle of transfer. if you see it in the same value, principal transfer is in effect. Okay, you taking a class right now, for example, you are paying money, you're paying your school fees, okay, in order to acquire some kind of knowledge, a degree, a diploma, a master's degree, a postgraduate degree. You want something in transfer for the value that you're giving out, for the amount of money that you're giving out. That's principle of transfer. All of you, some of you may be working adults, right? Listening to this, some of you may be working adults. And when you're working, your principal transfer is in effect. You're in exchange for money, you are giving your hard work, right? Your services, your knowledge, your expertise in exchange for a salary. Principle of transfer is happening there as well, right? Even when someone is giving something to you for free, like a birthday gift, I am still transferring the rights, what is originally mine, to you if I'm giving you a gift. Principle of transfer is in effect. So as you see, the principle of justice in transfer is a far more common way of wealth accumulation. Okay? Because essentially that's how the economy runs. We are paying something for whatever items that has value to us. We pay money for it. Okay? Of course, the whole idea of what is valuable is very subjective, but in order to acquire them, we have to pay money. And principle of justice in transfer is in effect. So let me recap. Step one, you either make it yourself or find it from a source that nobody owns. Okay, it's not very common for that to happen. So you go to step two. Wealth accumulation can also happen through transfer. So when you use cash, when you exchange goods for services, principle of transfer is in effect. Okay, so when we buy a car, when we buy a house that is in development, when we buy any real estate property, they are all principle of justice in transfer. Okay, so let's go back to the notes. We've talked about step one and step two. No one, going to step three now, no one is entitled to anything unless through the process of one and two. Okay, so let's say all of a sudden you found something, right, in a place where somebody owns it. Okay, in a place where there's ownership. So let's say you come to my house, right? You come to my house, and then for some reason you find a piece of gold in my house that I don't know it's even there. Okay, you find it. Let's say you discovered it. You come to my house and you discover a block of gold that I don't even know it existed. Now, in theory, it still belongs to me, but it's all right. Let's say you want to kickstart the process for you to claim it legally. What do you have to do? It still has to go through process one or two. So what happens is that you either have to pay me a certain amount in order for me to say, okay, now you can take it, or I have to be in agreement that I don't want it, you take it for yourself. Justice in transfer is still happening there. Okay, so even if it's something that previously has ownership and now does not, still has to go through some kind of a transferring principle for that item to be legally claimed as yours. Otherwise, it would still be regarded as illegal or stealing. Okay? Now, a simplified version in English, this is what it means here. Original acquisition, transfer acquisition, and repeating it in an unlimited cycle. So as I mentioned earlier, original acquisition means if you make it yourself or get it from an unknown or unowned resource or the wilderness, the acquisition is just, legal. Number two, transfer acquisition. If you make an exchange either through purchase or gift, the acquisition is also just. And the process is repeated in an unlimited cycle. Let me get a quick drink here. There you go. So you have process number one, process number two, and repeating these two processes and you keep on going until you reach a point where you're happy with the amount of wealth that you have. So it sounds great on paper, isn't it? Where you can have a surefire way of knowing how you can accumulate wealth. But herein lies the problem. It is not perfect. It has its problems. One thing is that it promotes the whole idea of greed. It does not tell you when to stop. It does not talk about the welfare of other people. It does not talk about what happens if you lose it all. Okay, let me give you an example. We've all known that of this whole idea of the stock market. And people invest in it, whether it is properties or invest in shares. It's there for people to invest. But we've also heard of plentiful of cases where they invest in a stock market and it crashed and it failed. Okay, they invest in the stock market and they crashed, and the whole stock market caused them to go bankrupt overnight. Okay, we've heard of all this happening before. What is there in terms of the economic system that safeguards these people? Now, of course, you can always argue that they're greedy. They invested too much. So it's their problem that this failed. And that's a good point, but putting yourself in their shoes, and if it's a loved one that has experienced such things before, you would expect that the society that you're living in, the governmental system that they exist in, has some way to safeguard them from this kind of danger. Okay, and unfortunately, Nozick's entitlement theory does not say anything about these group of people. What happens if you make a bad investment and you go from hero to zero overnight? What safeguards those people? Okay, so here's where Rawls' theory of justice come in. Okay, wow, it's been 52 minutes. So here's where Rawls' theory of justice come in. Building upon Nozick's entitlement theory, remember, this is not a replacement. This is more of building on top of Nozick's work. So Rawls is not disregarding Nozick's work totally. It's sort of, okay, you have a way of building your wealth. That's great. Now, what can we do to improve on it? Okay, so that's where Rawls' theory of justice come in. There are two basic governing principles for theory of justice. Number one is that certain familiar and fundamental liberties to each person must be guaranteed. These are things like your rights to an education, your rights to healthcare, your right to vote, for example, your rights to a roof over your head. Simple, basic human needs that needs to be protected. Okay, those must be guaranteed by every government, ideally. All right, ideally, those must be guaranteed by every government. Number two, social and economic inequalities are okay. In other words, it's okay to have a gap in wealth. You can have rich, you can have poor people, but they must benefit the least advantaged members of society. Any actions you take must benefit the least advantaged members of society. I'll explore this further later on. Okay, so Rawls used the concept of the original position. The original position refers to the two basic governing principles here. Okay, these two earlier points: fundamental liberties as well as justifying economic inequalities. That's the original position. So Rawls is basically saying that if you want to empower people to build their wealth and build it in a way that they don't worry that they can end up having nothing and have to jump down a building to end their life, you need to safeguard their welfare to a certain extent. Not totally, but to a certain extent. That's where the government has to decide whether you want to cover things like healthcare, education, so on and so forth. So that's why you see there are many countries in the world, especially the Nordic countries, where they charge an incredibly high amount of tax in order to give people free healthcare and free education, right? Singapore has a version of that where we have our our healthcare pretty much taken care of in the form of our Medicare or something, right? MediShield. We have our HDB systems where the idea behind it is that every PR and citizens have some way of affordable housing. So that's basically assuring that everyone has fundamental liberties guaranteed. Okay, that's the original position. So Rawls is basically saying you have Nozick's entitlement theory, and that's great. But before you even go there, make sure that you have that foundation of guaranteeing people the basic things. Okay. Then, now, before I get to this on the veil of ignorance, so in order to have those basic foundations taken care of, like I said earlier, some countries charge an incredibly high amount of tax to make it happen. Correct? The Nordic countries are one of the highest taxing countries in the whole world. And there's a reason for it. And again, they happen to be one of the happiest countries on earth, right? Measures to be one of the happiest, some of the happiest people on earth lives there. Okay, and there must be a reason why. So, in order for you to implement free education and free healthcare, somebody needs to pay for it. And of course, we are going to look into the government to do that. And in order for the government to be able to afford to give free healthcare and free education, just look at these two things alone, for example, the money has to come from somewhere, right? And what other way for the money to come except through taxing? So increasing the tax. Now, when we increase tax, there's no point increasing the tax for lower income groups because they are already doing not that good as it stands, right? So taxing the lower income group will not get you any more money. But taxing the higher income earners, the rich people, for example, that's where the bulk of the income is going to come from. So taxing the large organizations, the rich people, for example, so that's where you see tax can go as much as 50% of their salary. They don't like it, but they pay for it. 50% for people who earn, for example, $1 million or higher for their salary. 500,000 goes to the government. That's a lot of money. So when you get taxed so much money, you're going to complain. You're not going to be happy, right? You're going to say, why me? Why do I have to pay for all these things? Okay, I can afford healthcare. Why do I have to pay the government all this money? All these thoughts are going to go through your mind, right? You're going to start complaining because, again, just think about it in a very simple way. If you want to implement and have at some point free healthcare and free education, the money has to come from somewhere. And you're obviously not going to tax the poor. You're going to tax the rich. And when you tax the rich are going to complain. So what is a way around this? What can the government say? Rawls thought of this as well. That's where he came up with the idea of the veil of ignorance. Okay. So as I said earlier, conflicts of interest are bound to create irreconcilable demands. Wealthy people who build their wealth are very likely to choose Nozick's entitlement theory, and naturally so. And in contrast, those without properties, without a lot of wealth, they are going to be in favor of a redistribution of wealth. So to overcome this, Rawls is arguing that those people who are in the original position, should not and don't and will not know what social status they hold in society. Okay, so just imagine that you're starting off having nothing, or at least having nothing much. Okay, it's very likely that you don't even know where you will end up, whether you're rich, you're poor, you're successful, you're not. You don't know. You are just starting out. Okay, just like anyone who just finished college or anyone who just finished school, they are pretty much in the original position, right? So they don't know what status they will hold eventually in society. And when you don't know, you won't argue. So Rawls is basically telling all those rich people to sort of put yourself in a position where you have nothing. put yourself in a position where, imagine you're just starting out. That is the original position. Put yourself in your original position. And when you do, okay, you are going to be okay with the idea that you have all those important things taken care of. Okay? Now, that process of putting yourself in the original position, okay, is what Rawls called the veil of ignorance. Okay? Just put on that veil in front of you and ignore the fact that you are already rich. Ignore the fact that you are already there in the higher levels of society. Okay? Because in order for this economic system to work and safeguard the kids, safeguard the young ones, safeguard the future, something has to change. And if you're going to expect free healthcare and free education, money has to come from somewhere. The income has to come from somewhere. And obviously, it's not the right thing to do to tax the poor. So you have to tax the rich. And if you're if you're the rich person that is going to pay for all these things, you're just going to have to learn to ignore the fact that you have already made your wealth. Okay? So that's the veil of ignorance. This is what Rawls called this lack of knowledge. The veil of ignorance is where you put yourself in a position where you don't even know your race, your intelligence, your skills. You don't know your value in society yet. And when you don't know, you won't choose. And you'll be very thankful for the fact that you have things like free healthcare and education and all these things guaranteed to you. Okay? So this sort of accords with our humanity's sense of fairness and impartiality and objectivity. So, based on Rawls' two principles, okay, each person will eventually have an equal right to an extensive system where everyone gets equal basic freedom and liberties. Okay, so you're sort of preserving people's rights, people's fundamental rights to go do whatever they want, live the way they want, do it right, do it legally, of course. But at the same time, you're ensuring that society, everyone has an equal footing to start. Okay? And if you fail, you still have those basic things taken care of. Okay, so that being said, let me just wrap this up. Criticisms of capitalism. It's not a perfect system, like I said earlier. So here are a few things that exemplifies the problems when it comes to the capitalism system. Number one is the whole concept of rational choice. In order for you to stay competitive in a capitalist system, you have to keep on educating yourself. You have to keep on improving. Otherwise, you lag behind. That's what it means by high level of consumer literacy. Number two is the whole concept of inequality. Having a minority of people having control of the vast majority of wealth in this world. Okay? And the concept of free marketplace is challenged. Corporate welfare systems protects businesses from true marketplace competition. What that basically means is that the government systems, laws, policies that are in place are typically leaning towards the side of the larger organizations to protect their interests more than the workers. And of course, we have the problem of oligopolies, where you have large organizations buying up other large organizations and effectively having control over everything. There was this big debate of oligopoly when Disney was being blocked from the acquisition of buying up Fox and its film and entertainment branch. So it went through a long process of arguments and courtrooms because there was a debate on whether or not Disney owning Fox would effectively create zero level of competition among in Hollywood itself, and what is going to stop Disney from increasing the prices of everything if they own everything. Okay, so it breeds oligopolies. And what oligopolies eventually lead to is that it causes a lot of small firms problems if they want to join. Okay, so small firms like startups, business startups, they suffer when it comes to having high cost. It becomes difficult for them to join the industry because of such intense competition. And all these large firms, they can set prices, forcing smaller business to close down, buying up competition in order to eliminate threats and monopolize the industries. Further criticisms, you can look into corporate welfare programs that protects businesses. So many businesses, in order to protect themselves, always look to the government to come up with new laws and restrictions when it comes to imports, training subsidies. So a lot of organizations, they want to improve themselves, right? Remain competitive, and they always want the government to pay for it. So research and development subsidies, things like that. Competition is viewed as something negative because there is no proper regulation between these competitions. So there's a frequent negative correlation between performance and individual competitiveness. There's often the thing about competition is this: there is the whole idea of healthy competition where you have that equilibrium, right? The invisible hand. Those are good, healthy competition, but it can get to a point where it's gets out of control, right? And when that happens, organizations need to cooperate to best enhance any sort of achievement. So it cannot be a situation where prices go out of hand. At some point, organizations need to work together to come to a balance point as well. So as good as the invisible hand is, it does involve some kind of a cooperation. Okay? Think of it this way. If I keep fighting with you in terms of setting my price lower and lower and lower, at some point I'm going to lose money, right? So eventually I'm going to have to cooperate with you to have some kind of an agreement so that our prices can stabilize. That's essentially what healthy competition is. And you have the problem of exploitation and alienation. Employers, unfortunately, are able to exploit workers by paying them less than the true value created by their labor. Paying them less than the true value created by their labor. So, say for example, if you have the talent of sewing clothes, some reason you happen to end up working in a sweatshop, making clothes for large scale organizations like the Zaras and the Uniqlos and the H&Ms. As much as your work is valued, but it's valued at such a low rate. Okay. Comparatively, you can have someone who cooks or plays a musical instrument, totally valued differently, possibly even much higher than someone who sews clothes for a living. Right? So these are all caused by exploitation of workers, paying them less than the true value created by their labor. Okay? So these are further criticisms where capitalism enforces human tendencies towards being materialistic, wanting to buy more and earn more, and being very selfish and individualistic. And it requires humans to keep on consuming, which subsequently increases the standards of living. But even when you increase your standard of living, it does not necessarily deliver the promise that you'll be any happier than you were before. Okay? So one of the solution to this problem is the perspective or the view of socialism. Okay, just a bit of historical background here. It has its roots in Europe, and the idea behind socialism is that it's almost akin to a communist society, except that it's less bureaucratic, less centered in terms of power management, but a more of a communal view of sharing profit and sharing the wealth of the country. So let me go on to my final slide here on socialism. So No, it's not here. Okay, it's okay. Let me just explain it to you in person. So, what socialism essentially is that you're setting the country, right? The government is setting the country in a way that everything is has a limit. So you remember I talked about how much wealth can a person amass, right? Setting a limit on such things. You still can get rich, very rich, but there's a limit. Okay, there's also a limit to how poor you can get. So this sort of takes care of you in a way that allows you to still have a life, still live your life, but having the basic fundamentals taken care of. Okay, so everything is in moderation. The wealth of the country is shared in a way that does not leave anyone behind. At least that's the ideal behind socialism. There's a reason why it's not adopted. Okay, because it's just, well, put it this way: society has been rather used to the concept of capitalism by now. We have been living in a capitalist system for arguably 1,000 to 2,000 years. Okay, so it is already ingrained in us, that spirit of competitiveness, individualism, and self-interestness. So we the whole idea of freedom, liberty, do what you want, live the way you want, live your life, get your dream. It's too ingrained in us to a point where we grow up getting used to it, and uh, it hasn't sort of settled on society yet, where the whole idea of sharing, communal, everything has a limit, everything in moderation, just not quite there yet. That's why we still see a huge rise in uh, obesity levels, uh, huge rise in poverty, for example. It's all still there because we are still highly motivated to live in a capitalist system. So, as Rawls said, it's okay to be in a capitalist society. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that all the fundamental rights that human really needs, that society really needs, must be taken care of first. Then you empower people to do whatever they want. Okay? And just to sort of give this a wrap here, today, right, we have a few economic challenges that is faced by you and I, essentially. The first, of course, the first and foremost is the decline on Western manufacturing. The US used to be the largest economy in the world, right? By far the largest economy in the world for the longest time, until, of course, the rise of China. And for it all has its reasons. I'm not arguing about that. But the decline of Western manufacturing is not quite a problem, but something that you need to take note of. Because if Western manufacturing can decline, Chinese manufacturing can decline as well at some point. Maybe not now, maybe not in 20 years, but it could happen in 200 years. Okay? So anything that goes up will go down, right? The forces of the invisible hand will take time to happen. You just don't know when. So it is a challenge that people must be sort of, how should I put it? They must be aware of it, and they must be ready to embrace it when it comes. Outsourcing of jobs. The whole COVID-19 situation has led to a new wave of how people do their work. Okay? And what we need to realize is that organizations are starting to figure out that what's going to happen is that companies will realize that, hey, we don't need as many people to do the amount of work that we have. So they're going to cut down, or they're going to outsource certain jobs to pay less, put lesser value on certain tasks. You need to prepare for those things. Society needs to prepare for companies outsourcing jobs as well. That's why we have foreign workers. Okay, that's why certain paperwork is outsourced to other organizations in other countries because it's simply cheaper. Western trade deficits, and finally, the biggest one would be changing attitudes towards work. Younger graduates nowadays basically go into the workforce with a different idea on what they want in life. Not so much on rebuilding, but building towards a point where they might be happy and slow down. And organizations need to figure out a way to combat that. Even if they're not going to combat that, they need to figure out how they can continue to be competitive with a group of people that is not going into the workforce to compete, but going into the workforce to essentially just make a living. Right? Think about it this way. Our moms, our dads, our grandparents, they live in a different era where they're always into an idea of they need to rebuild their lives. Okay? They are all people who, in some capacity, have witnessed the effects of war. The baby boomers, the Gen Y people, for example, they're all people who have witnessed in some capacity the effects of war and have been on a rebuilding process. And now that we are living in a society that is essentially built for us, everything is already there, we get complacent, we get satisfied really quite fast. So it's not so much that we're looking to be competitive, but it's more so on what are the jobs that can make me happy. Job satisfaction become a key requirement for a lot of young graduates, as well as work-life balance. And organizations need to figure out how they can adapt such demands from their workforce, because without employees, they can't exist as well. So those are the main economic challenges that faces the world today as capitalism evolves from what it was back then to what it will become in the future. So that's basically it for this chapter on capitalism. And just to recap, it's basically how you can best run the system of capitalism in a way that is ethical, that does not cause people to live or get to a point where greed becomes destructive. The whole idea of self-interested or self-interestedness becomes a destructive force, that they go on a run where they keep on earning wealth, and they get to a point where if they fail, they get nothing. Okay, they fail they go from the top to the bottom, and nothing safeguards them. How can you run a capitalism system that can safeguard people from total failure? Okay, and that's where Rawls' theory of justice and the veil of ignorance comes in. So things for you to focus on for this chapter would mainly be the key features of capitalism, right? Defining capitalism, the key features of capitalism, the concept of the entitlement theory, as well as Rawls' theory of justice, and the veil of ignorance. So these should be your 5 main takeaways. Should you sort of forget everything else in this chapter, these are the 5 main important things for you to take note of moving forward. Okay, so thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.